Good to see everyone in chat. Welcome, John, Grom, and Padre, and everyone else who's going to be watching this later or on YouTube. Welcome to Behind the Screens. We are finishing up our look at Grimdark fantasy, which has always been something that I have, like I said, I've loved the genre. Again, from Black Company, Thieves' World, which isn't, it's not grim dark, but it's grim, all the way through the Second Apocalypse and First Law and Age of Madness and Empires of Dust. There's just a lot of really good grimdark fantasy going on right now. And a plug for somebody who I don't like. This is just a plug for something I love. Grimdark magazine is fantastic, and if you want to support them on Patreon, you get access to all of their back issues, and they've done some great interviews with authors in the field. They get breakdowns of characters, additional short stories. If you're a fan of Baker, I believe the Carathaean part 1 and 2 is in the Grimdark magazine backlog, which is just an amazing homage to the Conan stories that Baker wrote, and expands the lore a little bit more and is sufficiently dark and brutal and brooding. But today we're wrapping this up by looking at how can we as GMs replicate this for our players at the table? And I've thought a lot about this because a lot of the other genres we've looked at, they've had a lot of overlap in the fact of how magic is used and what is the focus of the story. And in a lot of ways, Grimdark has a lot of sword and sorcery parallels. When you look at the history of fantasy, it's interesting to me that really the epic fantasy genre starts in England, and the sword and sorcery genre really starts in the US. And then you have the responses to both on the other side of the pond, right? We get the Belgariad by Eddings, we get Shannara, we get the Wheel of Time, sort of in response to Tolkien's popularity, where the very early stories in all three of those series are very much following Tolkien's pattern. And in the UK, we get Elric and Corum and Hawkmoon, which are a direct sort of response to the Conan and the Howard's sort of the sword and sorcery, Fafhr and Grey Mouser. I mean, even in some ways, even Pratchett is a response to Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser and a lot of these things. Because, right, Ankh-Morpork is definitely a spoof or a Pratchettian response to Lankmar. So, John, I don't recommend beating your players, but if you have that as part of your table covenant, I would say that does help. Actually, you should probably soak the ruler first in smallpox or something like that if you really want it to make it grimdark. So I would say the first thing we need to focus on is keep it very personal. Grimdark stories, although there are outliers, very rarely focus on the grand sweep of the world, saving the world, etc. You know what, Padre? I have not read a lot of David. I don't think I've actually read any David Gemmell. I would assume that you would recommend it, bringing it up here in the chat. Right, even Baker, who the Prince of Nothing follows a crusade, and First Law, which follows the attempt to save the Empire, you end up focusing on the personal interactions. Like some of the best parts of the stories of Baker's work are the stuff around the fire, the individual personal things. So keep it personal. Keep the goals personal. Saving the world is a very impersonal goal. Finding out the history of a friend, finding out what happened to a lover, finding out where this cure for this disease or curse is. Those are very personal and personally focused stories. Rook, thank you so much. Welcome to the channel. Thanks for everybody thank you to Rook for everyone who just subscribed. It's always good to see you, my friend. I'm looking forward to our final Deadlands adventure. on Monday. So keep it personal. And by keeping it personal, you're also preventing the I am the hero of this story syndrome, right? You're not the hero. You're a person in the story. You are moving your way through the world. So keep it personal. Keep it focused. The 4 people in the party should feel like any 4 people in the world. Now, yes, they are caught up in the story, but to quote Simon, the Commoner King from The Last King of Austin-Ard by Tad Williams, the sequel to Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn, you don't realize you're in a story until you hear other people talking about it. That's the kind of feel we're going for in this world. It shouldn't feel like they're on a quest. They should have people reacting to them later on, days, weeks, months in game time, going, hey, those are the guys who robbed you know whose house. Also, speaking of that, to keep it personal, keep the goals very tight and personal. Why are you doing this quest or this adventure? Going back to our review of Eternal Night of Lockwood. Because we're all trapped here and somebody needs to figure it out. Why did you go rob that noble? Well, we needed to eat. Why did you go out into this ruin? Well, because we needed to break this curse. Those are all very personal and focused things. And it makes the world... You want the world in Grimdark to feel smaller than in epic fantasy or high fantasy, where the world is a character. You want a neighborhood or a city to feel like a character. Keep it human. And what do I mean by this? Well, here's the thing. Grimdark, a lot like Sword and Sorcery, needs to feel more humanocentric. Professor Dungeon Master has a great video on grimdarking up your 5e game. And one of the things he says is this, right? Foes, much like in Sword and Sorcery, need to be mostly human in Grimdark. Yes, there are terrors out there. There are the spawn of dark and evil things. There are ratmen in the sewers. There are lizard folk and beastmen in the woods. But those should punctuate your game of Grimdark. They shouldn't be the focus of Grimdark. In the Second Apocalypse, in the Prince of Nothing series, you very rarely see the Shrank, which is the orc analog in that world. And they're terrifying for a number of reasons, most of which are brew-like if you've read any Chlorantha. But you want to be focused on the human foes, the money changer who shorted them, the crime lord who has it out for the players, the temple prostitute who the player is really trying to protect because they've fallen in love with. So do Grimdark PCs have low self-esteem? Well, Ian, I know you're a huge fan of Thieves World. Look at Shadowspawn. I'm not saying Thieves World is Grimdark, but Shadowspawn really wrestles with a lot of things. And I don't think it's necessarily low self-esteem. I think it's part of the moral ambiguity that we're trying to put into this thing. Is this quest worth it? No one in a D&D game thinks, well, is this quest worth it? Right? I mean, we're going to get XP. We're going to find magic treasure. We're going to level up. Maybe we'll save the world. That is never the question in epic or high fantasy. It needs to be the question in Grimdark. Yeah, these people are our friends, but they've pissed off this person, and if we go to help them, is it worth the heat that is coming down on us? As often as you can, present the moral choices in the game as very ambiguous. I disagree. The line I dislike most in the Star Wars original trilogy is what is it? Obi-Wan in Empire Strikes Back says, Luke says, you lied to me. You said Darth Vader killed my father. And he says something along the lines of, what I said to you was true from a certain point of view. Here's why I don't like that line. That's ambiguity in a series that, at least at the time, was very much about epic good versus evil. So yes, I feel like Obi-Wan lied and manipulated Luke. We could talk a lot about this. Like, go back and watch when Luke and Obi-Wan are sitting in the cave, and Obi-Wan is trying to convince Luke to go to help rescue the princess with him. He starts off by trying to appeal to him through training, and then he's like, she needs your help. You knew that that was his sister, and yet... Anyway, we're digressing. So, it's not so much the idea that... Oh, we got stuff in chats. Well, they shouldn't. You've lost. Yeah. I would say that they're not on anyone's greeting cards list, and it's to their self-esteem. Well, that's another wall to shatter. So, thank you for summing up the motivation. Is Grimdark fantasy worth it? It's a tough sell. For me, it is. I enjoy the genre, and I enjoy the genre again because it's a mirror. It allows me to look at the darker things in our world through kind of the reflection of Grimdark fantasy. I also find that Grimdark fantasy, because I never know what is going to happen, there's a sense of tension there that I don't find in other fantasy. It's not to say that I don't love other fantasy. I'm currently making my way through Morgoth's Ring, so obviously I have a deep and abiding love for Tolkien-esque high fantasy, or epic fantasy. But yeah, I think it's worth it. There are different places to start. Richard K. Morgan's A Land Fit for Heroes is good. You just got to know sort of the content warnings going into Grimdark fantasy. All right, so keeping it ambiguous, present tough moral choices for this. While I wouldn't say that I wrote Jackals as a Grimdark fantasy, it's not. There is a very grimdark situation in the middle of Fall of the Children of Bronze. The player characters have discovered they're in the middle of a war between two sides of the same people. So everyone is Luwathi. They're just going to war over resources. And they discover a large massing of Takan, the beastmen of my world. And they're told to lead the Takan hoarding into the opposing army so that our side doesn't lose a lot of people. The Takan and the other army will fight each other, and then our army can move in and mop up the rest. And they're given a choice. Do you do this, even though it's morally reprehensible, to save a bunch of your own side, or do you come up with another solution? That's kind of the tension. So Grom asks for motivation. No, I think we keep it human as well. We keep it very focused on the humanity of the characters. Why are you doing this? Most likely because you're trying to help someone you love, hurt someone you hate, or make enough money to survive for the next day. Those are usually the three common goals. Yes, there's characters who search for knowledge. Yes, there are characters who try to do the right thing. But in the end, every choice a Grimdark character makes should tie back to their personality and their situation they find themselves in. That's why I like games that have professions for Grimdark, Zweihander, Warhammer Fantasy, as opposed to D20 games for Grimdark, which you're playing an archetypal class. You're a little bit removed from that gritty humanity just on a mechanical level. Ian says, I miss some things, but the character's internal conflict just as much as possible. In Grimdark, Sword and Sorcery, yeah, in Grim Sword and Sorcery and Grimdark, I would say the character motivations are similar, but in Sword and Sorcery, they lean 100% into the selfish or even possibly the noble ideal. And in Grimdark Fantasy, we may find a little bit of the darker selfish tinge, like revenge, hatred, lust for people or power. Those are all things we see written out large in Grimdark Fantasy, right? The idea that the ends justify the means is definitely taken to its extreme in Grimdark Fantasy. And then you got to keep it grim and gritty. And I know we talked a little bit about this in Sword and Sorcery, especially Grim Sword and Sorcery. But the fear of death should be ever present. Players should realize anytime we draw blades, someone could die. Do not feel bad about killing off beloved NPCs or acquaintances because it fits with the story, even if it's just to redshirt the player, because this is a world where people die. Diseases are your friend as a GM in Grimdark Fantasy. There should be a tension every time the players go into the sewers. What could we possibly get? If a player gets a disease, it should run its course and it should feel dramatic in its slow whittling away of what it means to be healthy and hale and a hero. I think that's the other thing about Grimdark Fantasy. The attrition of self, the attrition of health, the attrition of wealth. I didn't realize that was all going to rhyme, but I guess I'm a poet and didn't even know it. Grimdark Fantasy, when you achieve something, it should feel like it was a struggle every step of the way to get to that point. The victories should be smaller. They should last not as long. You should really think about when your players take out the crime lord that we were talking about earlier, what's the consequence? What's the response? Who steps in? Do the players step in just so that they don't have to deal with someone new? It is... Yes, Padre, that is very much the way it is. The idea of we're going to take as many people with us if we go. The heroic last stand is possibly the greatest point of Grimdark, especially if that last stand doesn't achieve everything that the hero wanted. Now, you may be asking now, JM, cool, I have a great idea of what I need to do to my players. The real question is, in a Grimdark game, how do I keep players coming to the table? If it's this attrition, if it's this morally gray story that just keeps grinding on, that's a tough one. You got to get players who are invested. And I think it's harder to get players invested in a Grimdark epic quest, right? You can't take the ring to Mount Doom in Grimdark. If Lord of the Rings was a Grimdark story, you know, Aragorn would have punched Frodo, possibly killed him, and claimed the ring for himself and become a new Dark Lord. But what you do is you keep the carrot, and you got to use the carrot and the stick in a Grimdark fantasy very carefully, probably more carefully than any other genre of fantasy that we have attempted. And here's why. The stick has to beat them down. The disease, the attrition has to keep grinding on. And yes, the victories are never perfect. They're never golden. They never last as long as you want. They get tarnished and fall away. That carrot still has to be there. They have to be able to save their friend when they're focused on it. Their deaths have to be meaningful in some way. They have to leave some impact on the world. In a land fit for heroes, there is a victory. In First Law, they do save the Empire at a cost. A terrible, horrible cost. And the guy who you think is supposed to be king does become king, even though he realizes he's a puppet for this other person. And yeah, maybe he does some good things as king, but it's not the pure Return of the King moment like we were looking for. I will check out Gemmel, Padre, and when I get through a couple of his books, maybe we'll chat about it here. So, that is sort of my advice on how to get this Grimdark fantasy thing off the ground. Again, you gotta have buy-in. One of the things that I think is really great about the Enemy Within campaign, and I'm still waiting for the last book before I do a Enemy Within review over the whole thing, is that while your characters have an idea, and it's a little too grand, if you will, for a Grimdark campaign, But things seem wrong or fine on the surface. The heroes are struggling to convince anybody that this threat exists. There are good characters or good NPCs in that story who are definitely trying to kill the PCs because, again, from their point of view, what the PCs is doing is wrong. There are times where you're going to want to ally with the lesser evil to take out the greater. These are the choices that they present. And I know that enemy or Empire in... What is the last one? Empire in Flames? Whatever the last one is, they've rewritten quite a bit from the original ending. So I kind of want to wait on that. But what's enjoyable about a grimdark fantasy is you're not going to save the world, but heck, maybe you saved your neighborhood or your city or your loved ones and achieve a great enough victory that they're fine for the next couple of years. You can go do something else. It's sort of the same heroism I love in Call of Cthulhu campaigns. Are you going to defeat the Elder Gods? No. Is your victory in the long run actually going to mean anything? Probably not. But maybe, if you're lucky, you can keep the world rolling on so that your children can grow up and your friends' children can grow up and live their lives completely unaware of the mythos and not having to worry about the mythos, at least locally. So, that is... Ooh. What is the overlap between noir and grimdark? Wow, that's a good question. All right, we'll finish up with that and then a couple of announcements. And then remember, next week we're going to be doing... What are we doing next week? Oh, Crossworlds Fantasy, which it'll be interesting because I have very limited experience with this genre aside from Stephen Donaldson, Thomas Covenant Chronicles, and Morden's Need, and also the Narnia series. But there's a couple other ones that have been recommended to me. I'll post the book list later this week in the Discord for our patrons if they want to take a look at it, and any other recommendations that you would have. I know a couple of people have recommended some animes. I could recommend Cool World as a movie that sort of fits in that genre. And then we'll take a week off. We'll talk about some other things, and we're going to jump into the sci-fi version of this because that's what you guys as the chat and the fans and the patrons requested. So, yes. So here's the thing. When we talk about Crossworlds Fantasy, all right, we're going to... A little bit of a spoiler. Yes, Rift War has two worlds. Torg Rifts does as well. But again... So the genre of crossworld fantasy isn't about multiple genre or multiple worlds. It's really about people from our world stepping into a fantasy world. And I think there's some cool ways we could do that, and there's some good advice that we can give, and it could prove... I think Savage Worlds is sort of perfect for this kind of game, but we'll talk about that next week. So noir is interesting because it has some very grim and gritty elements to it. But typically, you're expecting the detective to solve the story, to solve the riddle, not just of the mystery, but of himself, right? Most good noir has two layers to it. There's the surface detective layer, and then there's the discovery of self that the detective is going on. However, that when those 2 points meet, whether it's noir or whether it strays into more grimdark depends on the nature of the revelation. My favorite noir movie, which I don't know that I necessarily recommend, is Angel Heart, where a detective who is a veteran, I believe, of World War II, is hired to find a missing person. Basically, this person owes a rich person something, just a lot of money. And I can't tell you much more about the story without spoiling it. Needless to say, in searching for this missing person, the detective is finding out more about himself, and that revelation, that moment of revelation, is just utter... It's rock bottom for the character. The revelation sort of destroys the character. And... there are other stories like that. Devil's Advocate. Grimdark isn't limited to fantasy, right? Devil's Advocate with Keanu Reeves and Al Pacino, while maybe not a great movie, has sort of the same thing. What moral choices are you willing to slide on to get your gold? What are you willing to do as you move through the story? I have not watched it yet. I'm not making any comment on it aside from this. It's my one concern about Rings of Power. One of many concerns, but it's my primary concern. The fact that the showrunner said the story is really about how far into darkness would you be willing to go to save those you love. That was like Tolkien would never, like none of Tolkien's stories, he would have found that idea reprehensible. But it's sort of the core of Grimdark, right? Well, if the light can't save us, maybe I can use the darkness to do it. And there's all sorts of inherent flaws in that thinking that end up very poorly for our Grimdark protagonists. So, that brings us to the end. That was a great question, Grom. Thank you. Thank you all for listening through the slight derivation and rabbit trail that we went on there. So, don't forget, we got a couple of giveaways going on. When we get to 1,000 subscribers, I have a complete set of the Fading Sun's first Kickstarter books that will be going out. And we have something very special that we'll be announcing at the next Exploring Glorantha in September, that we're going to be doing a contest for something on the Johnstown Compendium. Also, if you're at all interested, the Strange Owl Games, which is the company that I'm involved with my wife and Tim Brown, we did an announcement here. The Patreon for Strange Owl Games has gone live, and we've pushed out the first playtest packets of Space 1889. So if you're at all interested in that, you should definitely go over there and check it out and get access to the Strange Owl Discord as well. There's a couple of great rewards, and we're going to be going forward from there. So we will be back on Tuesday where we start talking about Crossworld Fantasy, and I hope you all have a wonderful weekend. You can stay safe, you can stay healthy, stay gaming, and I will see you all on Monday for the final episode of the Horror at Headstone Hill, as well as Tuesday we'll do the next episode of the Diamond Armament and the next episode of Behind the Screen. So, have a wonderful weekend, and I will see you all next week. Have a good one.